Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for a virtual curator's tour of Down Home Jewish life in North Carolina. I am Kara Dedman, the museum curator of the North Carolina State Capitol, joining you from an office in the Capitol. I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. I see people are still coming in. We had 297 people sign up to attend this virtual event. So we're really excited, and I anticipate that people will continue to hop in and join us in the coming minutes. The Capitol is very lucky to host the exhibit Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina for April and May of 2022. And we want to thank our partner in the exhibit and program, Jewish Heritage North Carolina, for helping us make all of this possible. Before we begin tonight, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. First off, some of you have already started to do this, but please feel free to put greetings or where you are joining from in the chat. We would love to hear from you, and we really would love to know, where people are. During our presentation, we will disable the chat function. So if you'd like to, during the introduction, just take a moment, say where you're joining from. Hold on. Can everyone hear me okay? I saw a couple people say no sound in the chat. Awesome. Okay, just making sure. Technical difficulties. Okay, so again, if you would like to introduce yourself, please feel free to do so in the chat. Tonight, our program will consist of a few videos, including welcome remarks from Judge Mark Davis, the first Jewish person to serve on North Carolina's Supreme Court. And then Dr. Rogoff's talk will follow. Following Dr. Rogoff's remarks, we will have a question and answer period. If you have any questions for Dr. Rogoff, please use the Q&A function to ask them throughout the presentation or at the end during the Q&A. At that time, we'll try to go through as many questions as possible. We'll try to get to everyone's question if we can. So tonight, we are here to discuss the Down Home exhibit and celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month. So in honor of Jewish American Heritage Month, May 2022, the city of Raleigh has issued the following proclamation. Whereas Jewish American Heritage Month is a time to honor the significant religious, cultural, political, economic, athletic, intellectual, and philanthropic contributions Jewish Americans have made to our city. And whereas Moses Mordecai was reported to be the first Jew to move to Raleigh in 1810, and the first synagogue in the city was organized by Michael and Regina Grousman in the mid-19th century. And whereas the Jewish community in Raleigh has continued to grow over the subsequent decades with several Jewish state leaders, jurists, agency leaders, and other elected officials and civil servants serving in North Carolina's capital city since then. And whereas Raleigh continues to reinforce the importance of inclusivity in our community by encouraging active participation and recognizing the value and talent that people of all cultures and religions add to our workplaces and communities. And now, therefore, I, Mary Ann Baldwin, Mayor of the City of Raleigh, North Carolina, do hereby proclaim May 2022 as Jewish American Heritage Month and encourage all residents to take time to connect with and learn about their Jewish American neighbors. We just wanted to share that proclamation with you all. And now we would like to also share a statewide proclamation for Jewish American Heritage Month made by North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, as well as a special welcome from Judge Mark Davis, the first Jewish member of North Carolina's Supreme Court.
Hello, I am Jennifer Friedman Farley, joining you from the state capitol, the historic home of our state's legislature and current office of the governor. On behalf of the Division of State Historic Sites and Properties, we thank North Carolina's Governor Roy Cooper for issuing the following proclamation in honor of Jewish American Heritage Month, May 2022. Whereas Jewish American Heritage Month is a time to honor the significant religious, cultural, political, economic, athletic, intellectual, and philanthropic contributions Jewish Americans have made to our state and nation. And whereas the first Jew in North Carolina was Joachim Gans, who arrived at Roanoke Island on Sir Walter Raleigh's second expedition in 1585, and the Jewish community in North Carolina has continued to grow over the subsequent centuries. And whereas in 1809, Jacob Henry delivered a ringing endorsement of religious liberty when he defended his right as a Jew to serve in the state legislature, and the state has had multiple Jewish mayors, state legislators, jurists, agency leaders, and other elected officials and civil servants since then. And whereas Jewish North Carolinians opened pioneering schools dedicated to educating women, worked tirelessly for women's suffrage, fought for social and racial justice, and continue to work for the civil betterment of all people in North Carolina. And whereas the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust teaches us that combating prejudice, indifference, and systemic bias can create a more tolerant society, and North Carolina's Jews continue to work with members of all faiths so that never again shall any peoples suffer the evils of discrimination and racial or religious hatred. Now therefore, I, Roy Cooper, Governor of the State of North Carolina, do hereby proclaim May 2022 as Jewish American Heritage Month in North Carolina and commend its observance to all citizens.
Good evening, and thank you for joining the North Carolina State Capitol and Jewish Heritage North Carolina for a virtual curator's tour of Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina. I'm Judge Mark Davis, and on behalf of the Division of State Historic Sites, the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and Jewish Heritage NC, we appreciate you joining us from home to highlight this important exhibit. For more than 400 years, Jewish North Carolinians have shaped life in our state. Through a process of struggle and determination, Jews integrated into Southern society and were themselves transformed as Jewish culture and traditions encountered Southern customs. Jewish North Carolinians grounded their lives in timeless values, such as family, community, faith, and learning, all the while contributing to the state's economy, culture, education, and society. Jews in North Carolina continue to build their lives around contradictions, being rooted in Carolina soil, yet tied to a global community, embracing the here and now, yet reaching back to ancient traditions. This story is but one chapter in our country's ongoing immigrant saga, a story that new arrivals of all faiths and ethnicities are reliving in the changing South. In 2019, I was greatly honored to become the first Jewish member of the North Carolina Supreme Court in its entire 200-year history. In doing so, I joined a long list of Jewish North Carolinians who have served the public in the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. Tonight, we are hosting a virtual curator's tour with Leonard Rogoff, the primary curator on Down Home. Down Home features a 4th-century timeline of Jewish history in North Carolina and recounts individual stories of hard work and challenges of Jewish people who became Southerners while maintaining their cultural identity and religious lives. Dr. Rogoff will discuss how this exhibit came to be, as well as its underlying themes. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now here's the curator of the North Carolina State Capitol, Kara Dedman.
Thank you again to Judge Mark Davis. Dr. Leonard Rogoff holds a doctorate from the University of North Carolina, where he directed the English Writing Laboratory. He has taught at UNC, Duke, and North Carolina Central University. Former president of the Southern Jewish Historical Society and recipient of its Lifetime Achievement Award, he has lectured widely and contributed to numerous journals and anthologies. He now serves as historian and president of Jewish Heritage North Carolina. His books include Homeland, Southern Jewish Identity in Durham and Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina. His latest book, Gertrude Wheel, a Jewish progressive in the New South, won the 2017 North Carolina Historical and Literary Association's annual award for nonfiction. He conceived and served as research historian of the multimedia project Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina. And it is in that capacity that we will hear from Dr. Rogoff tonight. So Leonard, if you don't mind turning on your camera.
Unmuting. Hi.
Perfect.
Okay, we're ready. I'm risking some false advertising here, but rather than do a virtual tour, the condensed Down Home panels, I thought we'd take a more leisurely stroll through North Carolina Jewish history using images from those panels. North Carolina was really not thought to have a Jewish history, especially relative to its neighboring states of Virginia and South Carolina, which had Jewish communities in colonial times and synagogues by the end of the 18th century. Next. If you'll look at the statistics, you'll see that North Carolina on a numerical basis until very recent times has always had a rather small Jewish population by percentage among the smallest in the country. Next. That is not to say that Jews have not been here since the very beginning. The very first Jew to settle in British America arrived in 1585 on Roanoke Island on Sir Walter Raleigh's second expedition. I like to think of him as a contemporary of ours because he came here for some of the very same reasons that many of us did. His name was Joachim Gans. He was geographically mobile. He was a native of Prague who had immigrated to England. What brought him here was economic opportunity, the rise of global capitalism. He was a metallurgist and he was sent here to find precious metals. And some identify him as America's first scientist. When he returned to England, he got into an argument on the divinity of Jesus and confessed that he was a Jew, and he was arrested for blasphemy and imprisoned. So again, he was isolated. Next. How did North Carolina welcome Jews? Ambivalently. In 1669, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina welcomed Jews, heathens, and other dissenters from the purity of Christian religion. But in 1776, when a constitutional convention wrote the state constitution, it granted freedom of religion, but then it included a religious test that excluded anyone who denied the truth of the Protestant religion or divinity of the New Testament. In 1808, a Jew, Jacob Henry from Carteret County, was elected to the General Assembly, and a year later, his right to serve was challenged. Henry vigorously defended religious freedom and was allowed to take his seat. Jews protested the religious test, but in 1835, a state constitutional convention changed it from Protestant to Christian to include Roman Catholics. In 1861, the Confederate Constitution removed the Christian qualification and opened office to anyone who did not deny the divine authority of both the Old and New Testaments, seemingly opening it to Jews. By the end of the Civil War, the Jews felt differently. And it was not until 1868 with the Reconstructionist Constitution, which includes a religious test that excludes anyone who would deny the being of Almighty God, that Jews could constitutionally hold public office. Next. I think you're probably all acquainted with the theory of the three waves of Jewish migration. From the 1600s to the 1820s, there was a numerically insignificant arrival of Spanish Portuguese Jews. These were refugees from the Iberian Inquisitions who first made their way to Holland or England, and then to Latin America or the Caribbean, and came up the East Coast, American East Coast. By the 1750s, most of the immigrants actually were coming from German-speaking lands, including the Mordecai family, who arrived in Warrenton in 1792. From the 1820s to the 1880s, somewhere around 150,000 to 250,000 German-speaking Jews came from Central Europe. And this is the migration wave that established Jewish communities here in North Carolina. And then from the 1880s to the 1920s, about 2.5 million East European Jews arrived, and most American Jews are descended from this third wave migration. Next. We do find evidence of Spanish and Portuguese Jews on the North Carolina coast. Many of them were associated with Aaron Lopez, a wealthy Sephardic merchant in Newport, Rhode Island, who sent dozens of ships down the East Coast, and he had agents in places like Edenton, New Bern, and Wilmington, which developed a Jewish community. Many of them were members of his extended family, and we see their names are Sephardic, like Rivera, Lazarus, Lopez, Gomez, Judah Benjamin, who became a celebrated Confederate statesman, lived in Wilmington and Fayetteville. His mother was actually a member of Lopez's family. Next. As I mentioned, it was really the second wave German migration that established a permanent Jewish presence here in North Carolina. And this was a very typical family chain migration. Quite representative of these German Jewish immigrants were the Wheel family of Goldsboro. Herman Ettinger had been a peddler from Baltimore who worked eastern coastal North Carolina. He opened up a store in Goldsboro. He sent his brother-in-law, Herman Wheel, down to clerk in the store. Herman joined the Confederate Army and brought his brother Henry to take his place. After the war, the brothers opened the store and brought their brother Solomon down. Henry wound up marrying the daughter of a Jewish merchant, Emil Rosenthal in Wilson. And these family clans developed across Eastern North Carolina, and family and business intertwined. Next. Typically, Jews began as peddlers, usually with a backpack, worked up to a horse and wagon, and then if they found a propitious territory, they would open a store. When we read the credit reports, we see again that the Jews were welcomed ambivalently. For instance, the credit report said of H. Bitcherheimer in Rocky Mount in 1858, Jew hawks or peddles goods with a wagon. Such men are always regarded with distrust here. Next. If you want to see where the Jews settle, follow the railroad. In the 1850s, the North Carolina Railroad was built from Goldsboro to Charlotte. All along the railroad path, little farm villages, railroad depots turned into budding market towns and mill cities. Durham Depot was incorporated as a city of Durham. Greensboro, a little farm village, became a textile industrial center. The highest point on the railroad was named High Point and became a center for furniture manufacturing. If you look at this picture of Goldsboro, which was a railroad junction, you can see in the background a store that says H. Wheel and Brothers. Several other stores have Jewish names on their fronts. Next, please. Where did Jews stand on the great issue of slavery? Well, every study that's ever been made of slaveholding in the American South shows that Jews really did not differ from other Southerners of their class and location, with the exception that very rarely were Jews plantation owners. So they tended not to own very many slaves, but they might own household slaves. Or if you were a merchant, for example, and sold hardware, you might own a slave carpenter that you would rent out as you sold merchandise. Here we see an ad for a Jewish merchant in Warrenton who's selling his slaves. Next, please. When the Civil War broke out, North Carolina Jews showed themselves to be loyal Confederates. By one estimate, 70 Jews served from the North Carolina troops. Some of them paid with their lives. Jews had a more important role as economically, Wilmington became the lifeline of the Confederacy. And many Jews there were either Confederate agents or blockade runners, including Solomon Baer, who you see mounted on a horse. Next, please. After the war was the growth of Jewish communities of it, and in the 1870s, the rise of institutional Judaism across the United States. That's when a Hebrew Union College is organized, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Most Jewish communities formed according to the Talmudic formula of first the cemetery, then the city. Most communities had to cope with one dead Jew before they had 10 living ones to create a congregation. The very first of them actually was before the Civil War in Wilmington. Hebrew Cemetery was established in 1855, which is still in use. But starting in the 1870s and then into the 1880s, we start seeing these cemetery societies organized in places like Goldsboro, Tarboro, Raleigh, Durham, Charlotte. And they're very often complemented by ladies' benevolence or ladies' aid societies. And the Cemetery Society is an incipient congregation. It also takes responsibility to organize worship services, welcomes strangers, it provides for the needy, it educates the youth. And in the 1870s and 80s also, we start seeing B'nai B'rith lodges organized in communities across the state. Next, please. The first synagogue in North Carolina, again, still in use, is the Temple of Israel in Wilmington. And again, in the South, a synagogue serves as a Jewish church, and it really has a double function. One function is that it is obviously a place for Jews to observe their traditions, their faith, and to associate with other Jews. But it's also staking out its civic place in the town's faith community, attesting to Jewish prosperity and permanence. And interestingly enough, if you look at this synagogue, you'll see that its architecture is Moorish, which was a popular style in Germany and replicated by German Jewish immigrants in places like New York and Cincinnati. So Jews were cosmopolitans. They saw themselves not only as a local people, but but also affirmed their membership in the global Jewish community. And they were very aware of national and international developments among their fellow Jews. Next, please. Again, in the 1880s and 1890s, we start seeing synagogues arise again in North Carolina. And again, also notice that they're replicating church aesthetics. In Goldsboro, the temple there is neo-Romanesque. In Statesville, it's neo-Gothic. In Tarboro, it's Queen Anne Victorian, like much of the architecture in the town. And in Asheville, they actually purchase an old church and remove the steeple. Next, please. After the war, with the end of slavery, the South was reordering its society. And the racial status and the political, and social, and civic place of the Jew came under question. The most celebrated defender of the Jews was the Civil War governor and later senator from North Carolina, Zebulon Vance. At a time when the Chautauqua circuit the lecture circuit was considered the most popular entertainment, Zebulon Vance was one of its most celebrated speakers, and his most famous speech was The Scattered Nation in Defense of Jews. The Jews are our spiritual fathers, the authors of our morals, the founders of our civilization. Such a defense wouldn't have been necessary without an undercurrent of prejudice. And he confessed that there are objections to the Jew as a citizen, many objections, but he claimed that the fault was not the Jews, and he answered the charges that the Jews were dishonest. The Jews venerated Zebulon Vance. When he was alive, they presented him with a silver cane. After his death, they contributed to Vance memorialization. As late as the 1990s, a Jewish press was still reprinting The Scattered Nation. I suspect that those who really admire the Scattered Nation actually haven't read it. It's a piece of racial gibberish. It's filled with white supremacist rhetoric, and he exalts the Jews by denigrating African Americans. Next. Where did the Jews stand with the advent of Jim Crow in North Carolina? Well, if you look at 1898 during the Wilmington race riot, the mayor of Wilmington before and after the race riot, though not during the riot, was Solomon Fishplate. Fishplate, with several other prominent Jews, marched with the crowd that burned down the press that they alleged had provoked the riot. On the other hand, if you go up the coast to New Bern, you would find there Joseph and Meyer Hahn, who are both active in the B'nai B'rith Lodge and members of the synagogue that would form there. They run for public office on a Black Republican ticket. When he ran for sheriff, Joseph Hahn stood in front of a crowd of African Americans and urged them to fight. He was elected sheriff. He appointed Black deputies. And here's a racist cartoon from the Raleigh News and Observer excoriating Hahn, who chained a Black and white prisoner together and brought them to Central Prison in Raleigh. Next, please. In 1886, a journalist in Atlanta by the name of Henry Grady delivered a very celebrated speech in which he called for a new South. He said the new South would shun its backward agrarian past and embrace industrialization and urbanization. Out Yankee the Yankee. It would achieve racial harmony. Jews were quite instrumental in creating a new commercial New South. Most prominently in North Carolina were Moses and Caesar Cone. Their father had a wholesale house in Baltimore. They had come down to North Carolina as drummers, salesmen for their father's business. They began investing in textile mills. They wound up building mills of their own. In Greensboro, they created a textile empire, the world's largest manufacturer of flannel and denim, had something like 16,000 employees. In Statesville were the Wallace brothers. They were Bavarian, antebellum Bavarian immigrants. They opened up a mercantile house, and in this cash poor times, they took barks, herbs, and berries and roots in exchange for merchandise. They wound up with the world's largest herbarium. They had agents working in Europe. They were shipping ginseng by the ton to China. When at a time when North Carolina was perhaps the largest alcohol producing state in the country, the largest distiller in North Carolina was Solomon Baer of Wilmington, the producer of the Belle of Carolina wine. Samuel Wachowski was the leading developer, entrepreneur of Charlotte, created the home and savings industry in the state, and was largely responsible for the suburbanization of Charlotte. Next. With the rise of industrialization, cities grew and towns, creating commercial opportunities that could draw Jewish population. And then again, Jewish population is linked to growing urbanization. Next. And again, if you just look at any newspaper in virtually any town from these times, you'll see a host of ads for Jewish-owned stores, mostly in dry goods. Jews had an economic niche in dry goods. Next, please. This era of the New South, the 1880s to 1920s, coincides with the migration of millions of East European Jews. And again, they in many ways replicated the German pattern. It was a family chain migration as a young Jew arrived, beginning as a peddler, opening a store, sending his money to bring his family down one at a time from Europe. Next, please. The first large number of Jews came to North Carolina as a result of the industrialization. In the early 1880s, Buck Duke decided to get into the manufacture of cigarettes. At the time, New York City was the headquarters for cigarette manufacture, and it was a trade frequently practiced by immigrant Jews. Duke went up to New York and he found on a dock a young Ukrainian immigrant named Moses Gladstein, who was leading a strike of Jewish workers. Duke contracted with Gladstein, who brought about 125 of them down to Durham. They did what Jewish workers do. They formed a union. They began radicalizing local workers. Duke automated his factory, fired the Jewish workers, although he did pay off Gladstein, who remained in Durham and brought his brothers down, and the family is still established in Durham today. Next, please. When I do oral histories and travel the state and asked people in places like Reedsville or Hickory or Roanoke Rapids, what brought your father or grandfather here? Very frequently, they tell a story that begins in the Baltimore Bargain House. The Baltimore Bargain House was owned by Jacob Epstein, who himself had been a Lithuanian immigrant who started out as a peddler and become fabulously wealthy. He always had a soft spot for his fellow Jewish immigrants, and he maintained agents at the railroad stations and on the docks of Baltimore to greet the ships. And when immigrant Jews came in, they'd be taken to the Baltimore Bargain House, and they'd be shown a map, and it would be explained to them that there's a new railroad spur going into Scotland Neck. There's a new textile mill opening in Roanoke Rapids. These places could use a store. And Epstein would say, I'll give you merchandise. You pay me back on credit when you sell the merchandise, and I'll send you more merchandise. Here you can see a receipt dated 1892 for Morris Goodman in Raleigh, North Carolina. And if you look carefully, you'll see it's written entirely in Yiddish. Next slide, please. And again, A.M. Schrago is quite typical. He comes to Edenton in the 1890s to peddle. There's a crop failure. He learns about a prosperous city of Goldsboro. He picks up and moves, opens up a store, and becomes a very prosperous citizen there. Next, please. Seemingly every town in North Carolina had what was called a Jew store, usually a dry goods store. If you were in Spindale or Mount Gilead, there might be one store. If you're a larger city, Durham, Greensboro, Charlotte, or Raleigh, or Wilmington, there'd be whole Jewish business districts. J.S. Mann was so proud to be a Jew that he put a Star of David, I don't know if you can see it there, on his sign as well as on his shopping bags. Heilig and Myers were Latvian immigrants in 1911. They started out selling secondhand furniture and wound up building the largest furniture retail empire in the country. Leon Levine's father had a department store in Rockingham, North Carolina. As a teenager, he opened a bargain basement there. He eventually moved to Charlotte and opened a store called Family Dollar. He eventually had 6,000 of them. Max Samet was an immigrant who took over an old saloon and sold secondhand furniture. I think if you drive to Raleigh or to Greensboro along the highway, you'll see these mammoth construction sites, Samet Corporation. Those are his grandchildren. Next, please. As I mentioned, Jewish stores spread across the state. Many downtowns were anchored by a Jewish-owned department store, such as Bon Marché in Asheville, Klein Lazarus in Raleigh, Kronheimer's in Durham. Also, most towns had at least one Jewish-owned scrapyard. Junk peddlers who were too poor to get to peddle merchandise would go in the countryside and scour rags, glass, and metal. Today, I think El Gordon is in Statesville is the largest scrapyard on the East Coast. The Brenner brothers in Winston-Salem started as a scrapyard, and they became metal fabricators, and now they're Amar Industries, I think is in 16 states and 4 foreign countries. Next slide, please. With the East European migration, the number of Jews grew from about 820 in the 1870s to about 8,200, 10 times by the 1920s. And the number of synagogues grew from 1 in 1876 to 22 in 1927. Typically, in most communities, Jews would worship together. The German Americans had acculturated to a Reform Judaism. The East Europeans still held to their orthodoxy. when communities reached a critical mass, they would divide into a typical pattern of what's called the synagogue and the temple. There would be an Orthodox synagogue and a Reformed temple, such as we can see this Reformed Temple Emmanuel here in the center in Greensboro. And we start seeing Orthodox synagogues rise across in places like High Point and in Durham. Small towns like Hendersonville have small buildings. Kinston has a former church. In New Bern, the temple was designed by Herbert Woodley Simpson, who is the leading architect of the town. A lot of these synagogues are built in what's called the cathedral style. They're architecturally eclectic, but again, they're attesting to Jewish permanence and prosperity. Next, please. The post-war years were not happy years for American Jews, or they were challenging years, I should say. With the mass migration, there was an outburst of nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, such as we're seeing again today. In 1915, the Ku Klux Klan revived, most notably in the lynching of Leo Frank in Atlanta. In 1925, a Jewish salesman outside of Williamston, North Carolina, was assaulted by a Klan mob who mutilated him. There were campaigns for 100% Americanism, and immigrants were attacked as aliens, as political radicals. In the 1920s, the Congress put an end to open immigration. And this was the era when social discrimination was implemented. There were anti-Semitic housing covenants that kept Jews out of certain neighborhoods. You wouldn't find Jews in Biltmore Forest in Asheville or Myers Park in Charlotte. Jews had difficulties joining civic and country clubs. Universities imposed quotas, and certain industries like banking and insurance, and in many communities, teaching, were closed to Jews. And then in the 20s and 30s, there are the voices of Father Charles Kaufman on the radio and Henry Ford in his Dearborn Independent newspaper spewing anti-Semitism. And as we'll see in the 30s, Nazi propaganda abroad was echoed here at home. Next, please. While this was going on, while Jews were being accused of being a foreign influence, Jews themselves were acculturating as Southerners and Americans. One of the agencies of this integration was the military. Jews were patriotic, although many of them were of German background in World War I. In fact, the first North Carolinian to be killed in action in World War I was Arthur Bleedenthal of Wilmington, who was shot down as a pilot in the Lafayette Escadrille. The airport was named for him. Sports was another agency. I see him. Jews were prominent mostly in basketball. I see I'm missing a picture here. And in 1928, Harry Schwartz was captain of the UNC football team. And Jews actually sank roots in their communities through their real estate investment. They had a penchant to purchase their homes. Here we see Michael Barker in Wilson, North Carolina. And I was also struck by the number of Jews who turned to farming. Jews had been denied the right in many European countries to own land. Louis Baer had a furniture store in Dunn, but he was also a gentleman farmer. Here you see him at a tobacco market. Selma Katzenstein of Warren Plains had over 1,000 acres of farms. She was probably the largest woman farmer in North Carolina. Her family had first came down in the 1870s when her father was a gold panhandler. Next, please. The second generation was demonstrating that typical Jewish social mobility. And another agency of acculturation was the Jews went off to college. Chapel Hill was a school of choice for Jewish men and women's college in Greensboro for women. Here's a picture of 1907 of the Jewish women at a women's college gathered together. In the 1920s, we start seeing Jewish fraternities and sororities being organized on campuses, and the very first Jewish faculty, perhaps the most distinguished of whom was Milton Rosenau at UNC, the founder of the School of Public Health there. Next, please. Perhaps the most outstanding example of this social mobility was Gertrude Wheel at the very far left here of Goldsboro. Her father was a Bavarian immigrant who came down starting as a peddler and a clerk and became extremely successful. Gertrude was sent off to the Horace Mann School in New York to finish her high school, and then became the first North Carolinian to graduate from Smith College. She returned to Goldsboro, where she threw herself into every social justice, social welfare, and Jewish cause imaginable. She was the state's leading suffragist, the president of the Equal Suffrage Association of North Carolina in the fight for the woman vote. Next, please. In the 1930s, Jews also, as I mentioned, Nazi propaganda echoed here in the States. And the question focused on opening America's doors for European Jewry, and the fight for open immigration was the focal point. Many Jews in North Carolina worked strenuously to try to bring their European families to America. The two of the leading isolationist voices were here in North Carolina. U.S. Senator Robert Reynolds, first elected as a New Dealer, made statements like, "You can't trust Jews." He threatened to build a wall about the United States so high and so secure that no single alien or foreign refugee from any country upon the face of the earth could possibly scale or ascend it. Sound familiar? North Carolina, Asheville was the home of William Dudley Pelley, the self-styled American Hitler, who established his Silver Shirt Legion, fascist legion there. Neither man was popular. Reading the writing on the wall, Senator Reynolds decided not to run for re-election in the 1940s. Pelley was driven out of Asheville by the sheriff. Next, please. North Carolina was also the home of two of the most prominent advocates of Jews, most notably UNC President Frank Porter Graham, who lent his name to every Jewish cause, from the Ashel B'nai B'rith to the Hebrew University. He was outspoken in urging open immigration. He testified in Congress. He opened the UNC faculty for emigre scholars. Josephus Daniels, as ambassador to Mexico, also advocated for open immigration. After the war, he became a very prominent Christian Zionist. His very last speech he delivered was at a synagogue. He put on a skull cap and delivered a very fiery speech in support of a Jewish Palestine. He died very shortly thereafter. Next, please. North Carolina did welcome emigre scholars. Among the notable academics to find haven here were William Lewis Stern at Duke. He was a leading German psychologist who had coined the term intelligence quotient, IQ. Raphael Lemkin had been a professor of law at the University of Warsaw. He was smuggled out of Nazi Europe. He became a tireless advocate, and in a book, he coined the term genocide and was the author of the Genocide Convention adopted by the United Nations. Ernst Manasse had been a professor of philosophy from the University of Berlin. He found sanctuary at North Carolina College for Negroes, now North Carolina Central. He was a lifelong professor there and the first white professor to become a professor emeritus. Next, please. In eastern North Carolina, in the coastal plain, there was an agrarian colony of mostly Jewish emigres, refugees. It started in 1939. About a dozen families settled there. These economists, artists, art dealers, business executives, professors struggled to become dirt farmers, and by the mid-40s, 1940s, the colony had expired. Next, please. Jews, of course, had an extra incentive to want to fight in World War II, and every North Carolina town expressed pride in their sons and daughters, such as we see here for Winston-Salem, who joined the armed services. But it wasn't only in the military where Jews served. On the home front, in the Red Cross and civil defense, in the USO, Jews and Christians worked together, got to know each other, and social barriers were breached. As GIs returned home from the European theater, they had seen the consequences of racial and religious prejudice, and that those years marked the beginning of the end of the discriminatory barriers that had been separated Jew and Christian. Brotherhood became a civil religion. Next, please. Perhaps nothing exemplified this than the example of the 4 chaplains who had sacrificed their lives, giving their life vests when the troop ship Dorchester had been torpedoed. They were held up as the examples of Americanism. The rabbi who went down locked in arms with his fellow clergymen on the Dorchester was Alexander Good, who had been the base chaplain at Seymour Johnson Air Base in Goldsboro. His father, the Reverend Goodkovitz, had served in High Point and in Kinston. Next, please. And again, North Carolina did offer sanctuary after the war to Holocaust survivors. Here we see a picture of a group in Greensboro. In the front is Elias and Esther Mordecai, who are Greek Jews, and they're showing the tattoos from Auschwitz. Next, please. As happened after the Civil War and World War I, there was a religious revival after World War II, which affected not just Jews, but Christians as well, as synagogues and churches by the thousands sprouted across the country. The GIs were returning home, establishing families, and this was also marked the suburban dispersal. And in communities like Durham, the upper right corner, Asheville, Fayetteville, and Winston-Salem, the downtown Orthodox synagogues were abandoned, and these new conservative or reform temples arose. Smaller communities such as Rocky Mount and Whiteville, which never had synagogues, now had these Jewish community centers, which were conceived of not just as houses of worship, but also as social centers. Next, please. The philanthropist Heidi Blumenthal was concerned about the numbers of Jews who lived in small towns across North Carolina, the Spindales, the Mount Airies, the Jacksonvilles, which might have only 1, 2, 3, or 4 Jewish families, too small to form a congregation. So he outfitted a bus as a synagogue and hired a rabbi to drive it. And the circuit riding rabbi drove around where he conducted Shabbat services and held Sunday schools and adult education classes out of his synagogue bus. Next, please. The Jews had a sense of themselves as an extended family. And this had both a local, they affirmed their membership both in their local and the global Jewish community. Locally in 1921, Sarah Wheel of Goldsboro had established the North Carolina Association of Jewish Women, the only such organization in the country, which spawned the youth and men's auxiliaries. They held annual meetings, many of them gatherings at the B'nai B'rith gatherings at the Blumenthal's Wild Acres Retreat in Little Switzerland in the mountains. The Jews all seemed to know each other. They had from the Jewish fraternities and sororities on campus. Someone always had a brother or sister to date. There were Jewish summer camps where they were bunkmates, Blue Star and Young Judea outside of Hendersonville. They created their own Jewish home for the aged in Clemens outside of Winston-Salem. And Hadassah, from the very beginning, Zionist Organization of America chapters sprouted across the state. I think I counted about 8 Hadassah chapters. Here is a picture of one Hadassah activist, Gertrude Wheel, with Morris Leader of Goldsboro. They're in Charlotte, where Eleanor Roosevelt is signing a Zionist proclamation. Next, please. Perhaps nothing marked the sort of duality of Jews as both acculturated Southerners and their sense of Jewish difference as a Jewish debutante ball that was held in High Point. Jews were excluded from elite Christian society, so they held their own ball. And it was always very important for parents. Their chief concern was that their Jewish child find a Jewish mate. So they would gather families from distant communities and hold dances to make sure that they were all bonded. Next, please. And one of the things we see, again, with the breakdown of social barriers is the numbers of communities electing Jews in the post-war years as mayors. Mud Evans is elected 6 terms in Durham. His brother Monroe serves in Fayetteville. Benny Schwartz in Greensboro. Ben Cohen in Greensboro elected to mayors, but not only in the cities, but in the small towns. David Weinstein's mayor of Lumberton and Emmanuel Leinwin. He's the only Jewish family in Elizabethtown, and he's also the town mayor. Next, please. Perhaps the most famous, if not the most representative Jew from North Carolina was Harry Golden. Harry Golden came to North Carolina in the 1940s as a labor journalist. In 1942, he started his Carolina Israelite newspaper, which grew to a circulation of 30,000. It was read nationally and even internationally. Golden had 2 books on the bestseller list at the same time. He was a favorite of late night television, and he counted among his friends Carl Sandburg and the Kennedy brothers. If he's remembered at all today, as we will see, it was for his civil rights advocacy. Next slide, please. As you all know, basketball is a religion, and if there was celebrated Jews in North Carolina, they were Lenny Rosenbluth and Art Heyman. Both of them were National Players of the Year. Rosenbluth leading the UNC to an undefeated national championship in 1957. In fact, many sports pundits date the start of the ferocity of the UNC Duke basketball rivalry to a brawl that broke out when 2 players came up fighting in a game. And who were the combatants? Larry Brown of UNC and Art Heyman of Duke. 2 Jewish boys from New York created a Southern legend. Next, please. Perhaps nothing epitomizes the Jewish acceptance in North Carolina than the election of Connie Lerner as Miss North Carolina in 1971. She was a daughter of Auschwitz survivors who was active in Jewish youth groups. Notice she is not a blonde-haired, pale-skinned, blue-eyed Southern belle. She's dark-haired, olive-skinned, and dark-eyed. It shows again that Jews were willing to embrace immigrants now as one of their own. Interestingly enough, that year, the runner-up for Miss North Carolina was an African-American woman. Next, please. When the Civil Rights Movement came, Jews found themselves in a rather uncomfortable place. They were sympathetic to Black aspirations. When I do oral histories, many Jews become very emotional, recalling the nannies who raised them, who were like second mothers. On the other hand, Jewish merchants depended upon the goodwill of their customers. Jews in many towns were the very first to hire African Americans as clerks in their store, had more liberal practice in terms of allowing Blacks to try on clothes and to extend credit. But again, they found themselves felt that they were caught in the crossfire. Next, please. That is not to say that there weren't Jewish activists. As you all well know, the numbers of civil rights activists who came south were disproportionately Jewish. This is the Journey of Reconciliation in 1947. Freedom Riders, they were arrested in Chapel Hill. Igal Rodenko, one of the Freedom Riders, was brought in front of a judge who asked him if he were a Jew. When he said, "Yes, I am," the judge sentenced him to an extra 30 days on the chain gang. Howard Goenstein came to UNC in the 1940s as a student. He became a disciple of Frank Porter Graham. He returned to North Carolina, where he was active in organizing the civil rights movements and demonstrations in Chapel Hill and in Raleigh. Harry Golden, in his newspaper columns, made a mockery of racial segregation. He kept coming up with these absurd Golden plans that ridiculed segregation practices. Dr. Martin Luther King was so admiring him that he named Harry Golden by name in his letter from Birmingham jail. Gertrude Weil opened up her homes for meetings of the Biracial Council, and her family was instrumental in the integration of Goldsboro. Next, please. The civil rights era was also marked by changes in the North Carolina economy. With the decline of the cotton, tobacco, and textile industries, there were no longer thousands of workers flooding inner city streets to patronize Jewish stores. Moreover, with the movement to the suburbs, the economic life of the communities moved out of the downtowns. Moreover, the small town independent merchant could not compete with the Walmart or with the shopping malls. Next. Moreover, there was a demographic change taking place among American Jewries. As the second and third generation went off to college, they abandoned the retail and managerial trades of their parents, and now a majority of Jews were in the professions or entrepreneurial fields. In 1968, a new word entered our vocabulary, the Sun Belt. And just as the New South welcomed the Jewish peddler, storekeeper, merchant, industrialist, so too the Sun Belt has welcomed the Jewish scientist, engineer, artist, professor, and entrepreneur. Next, please. And symbolically enough, North Carolina takes pride in its, I think we have 6 Nobel Prize winners. Disproportionately, 3 of them are Jews, Gertrude Elion, Martin Rodbell, and Robert Lefkowitz. Next, please. So where do we find Jews today? Again, it's those places that made the transition into the post-industrial economy. Thus, in the old New South mill and market towns, the historic communities, we see Jewish communities are declining or dying. Congregations closing in Tarboro, Rocky Mount, Wilson, Lumberton, Jacksonville, Weldon, and Goldsboro. And where do we find new congregations? Well, Greenville. Greenville has ECU and the Brody School of Medicine. So we see Jewish communities rising in college towns, new synagogues in Boone and Chapel Hill, in high tech and medical centers, the Triangle, the Triad, Charlotte, in retirement centers. Jews are disproportionately elderly. New synagogue congregational developments in Brevard, Boone, Pinehurst, Nags Head, Lake Norman again. And also Jews, like other people, are being priced out of cities. So Jewish communities are growing in exurbs like Cary and Morrisville and Concord. Next, please. Downtowns are being transformed, whereas they were once centers of commerce. Now they are increasingly entertainment centers where you go to see a show and have a nice meal, or they're medical and health centers. The Brody family endowed the School of Medicine at ECU in Greenville, and you'll find Jewish sponsored hospitals in many, many cities. Also, Jews were prominent in museums, the Nasher Museum in Durham, the Levine Museum in Charlotte, the Blumenthal Art Centers. Jews were active in creating art centers in Wilson and in Goldsboro. I found 2 towns that are named after Jewish benefactors, Robbins and Rossman. Next, please. And again, we start seeing Jews, a commonplace for Jews to be elected mayors, including the incumbents, Esther Mannheimer in Asheville and Terry Mann in Whiteville. Steve Schul just stepped down in Durham. Mel Cohn served 9 terms in Morganton. Next, please. And for the first time now, we're having Jews elected to statewide office. As far as I can tell, Josh Stein, when he won the Attorney Generalship in 2016, was the first Jew to win a statewide election. Kathy Manning was of Greensboro, the first to be elected to Congress. Mark Davis, as we just heard, was the first on the state Supreme Court in 2019. And of course, Mandy Cohen was a public face of the state's COVID response. Next, please. Right now, we count about 46 congregational developments in North Carolina, attesting both to the rapid growth, exponential growth of population and increasing prosperity. Next, please. If you'd like to learn more, I invite you to explore our Jewish NC website. And with that, I'll thank you and welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Leonard. That's just amazing to hear you walk through, 400 years of history. We do have several questions. If you have a question for Leonard, just put it in the question and answer feature, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So the first question is that the chart had, I think the chart at your one of your very first slides had the number 10 million approximate for the US Jewish population. They just asked that could you explain that number at all?
Yeah, I think I put two numbers down there. I can't go back and look I don't have the slide in front of me. There are two sources of Jewish population surveys. One is the Jewish Data Bank sponsored by the federations. The other is the, get the title right, American Jewish Population Project sponsored by Brandeis University. One probably estimates about 6 million. The other, the Brandeis study, tends to be much more optimistic and saying 10 million. And then you're also caught up with this who is a Jew question. The Brandeis studies makes a distinction between Jews by religion and a much broader definition of Jews, such as self-identification or having a Jewish parent. So again, those numbers are contested, but those are the estimates that they're giving.
Okay. Which temples from the early 1800s, or sorry, the 1800s or early 1900s are still in existence today?
Well, certainly the Temple of Wilmington, which just I believe is concluding a fundraising drive for its renovation and preservation. That dates to 1876. The synagogue in Goldsboro dates to 1886. It is not in use as a synagogue now, but David Wheel and Emily Wheel of Goldsboro, who are descendants of one of the founding families, have taken it upon them to preserve the building's architectural integrity, and its annex is used as a community kitchen. The 1892 Temple Emmanuel in Statesville is still in use and has just recently completed also a major renovation campaign. The 1906 New Bern Temple, B'nai Shalom, is also still in use. And the, I guess, 1922 Temple Emmanuel in Greensboro is still owned by Temple Emmanuel, which has moved to a large suburban campus, but I'm not sure of its status right now, but it's still owned by the congregation and is used periodically for events such as weddings and occasional services.
Okay. I think that you just said this number, but if you would like to reiterate it, how many temples are there in North Carolina?
Well, there are 46 congregations, and I'm not sure that temple is the exact word. For example, in Brevard, they meet, they jokingly refer to themselves as the Sacred Heart Synagogue because they meet in the Sacred Heart Catholic Church. So it's certainly a functioning, thriving congregation, but it's not a temple. Actually, how many have buildings? I'd have to do a head count. And then you'd have to add Chabad into it also. But we've been able to identify 46 functioning congregations. In the Outer Banks, for example, they meet in a Unitarian church.
Is the Family Dollar chain still Jewish owned?
It merged with Dollar General relatively recently.
Okay. Okay, there are a couple longer ones. What are your thoughts on North Carolina's Jews' motivations for fighting on behalf of their home state in the Civil War, considering that the state constitution prohibited them from voting or holding office?
Yeah, well, they certainly made note of that in the 1860s when they were pleading for an end of the religious test. They were writing letters to the newspaper, that when the time comes, North Carolina Jews will prove their loyalty and their citizenship, and even in the national Jewish press was attacking this Jewish disqualification in North Carolina. But I think they were swept along like everyone else. If you really want to read to get an idea of the Jewish, what would have motivated a Jew to join the Confederate Army, I would suggest you read The Diary of a Tar Heel Confederate by Louis Leon. It was published in 1904, and it's his day-by-day diary of he was a German immigrant who first lived, his parents were still living in New York. He was clerking in a store in Charlotte, and he joined the Confederate Army. And he mentions that Robert E. Lee grant furloughs to Jews for the high holidays, and he was just swept along in the war fever, just as much as his fellow Southerners were. And when they enlisted, the war promised to be short and glorious, and he wanted to demonstrate his manhood. He certainly took notice that how the local ladies of Charlotte admired the soldiers, and they also were paid a nice bounty to join the Confederate Army. So for a poor immigrant, it was certainly an inducement.
Okay, kind of along that same topic, what are your thoughts on Zebulon Vance's motivations for promoting tolerance of Jews in his Scattered Nation address? And then this person goes on to say, while he earned widespread admiration among Jewish North Carolinians for his promotion of religious tolerance, in that same speech, he also disparaged African Americans as a negative foil to the Jewish people, which quite frankly makes the speech hypocritical in a lot of ways. So yes, you kind of addressed this, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, two things. Vance, like most traditional Southerners, was raised on the twin pillars of classical literature and the Bible. There was a very, very strong identification among Southerners, thinking of themselves as a suffering Israel. And they very much identified with the Israelite saga. There was a very strong, even if you look at Southern folk ballads, for example, there's a very, very strong old, what we call Hebrew Bible now, but Old Testament strain going through Southern culture. A lot of people attribute it to the fact that in Statesville, Zebulon Vance was arrested by federal forces, and they wanted to humiliate him and put him on a mule to ride him to the train to take him to prison. And Samuel Wachowski, who was then a merchant in Statesville, offered his horse and buggy and drove Vance with more dignity to the train that took him north. And Wachowski and Vance became lifelong friends. And I think it's a little more than that. I do think that there was a very strong Southern identification with the Israelite saga, especially after the war. They thought themselves as a suffering Israel who had been defeated and in some sense exiled.
Okay, we maybe have time for a couple more questions. And so if you have questions for Leonard, remember to put them in the Q&A. Okay, my grandmother stayed at a German Jewish summer place near Hendersonville. Do you know anything about this?
Oh yeah, I'm not so sure about the area around Hendersonville was known as the Southern Catskills. And it started out, there were a number of Jewish boarding houses there, a number of inns and resorts. I think the last of them was the Rubens Osceola Inn. They evolved from kosher to kosher style, and then they eventually expired. Yes, but there still are two Jewish summer camps right outside of Hendersonville. And that was, there's a lot of folklore about the Jewish resorts and boarding houses in that area.
Okay, this one you might feel passionately about. If there were so many Jews, where are the traditional Jewish foods/restaurants?
Well, there's a very perennial topic of discussion is about why can't we have a great deli in our town? But the truth of the matter, it was easier to find kosher food a century ago. Very often, the Rebbetzin, the rabbi's wife, might operate a little kosher deli in her home. There were traveling shochetts, ritual slaughters, would go from community to community. And virtually every town employed a kosher butcher. Many of them also had kosher bakers. And especially in the post-war years, there were a lot of Jewish delis across North Carolina, which became legendary. Some of them, there was Harry's in Chapel Hill, the upstairs room, or Marcus Famous Deli in Raleigh, Tenner's in Charlotte, Mushy Finds in Greensboro. And this was a place where traveling Jewish businessmen would meet, and they were often the town centers at Levine's Deli in restaurant where African-American cooks prepared Jewish delicacies. The governor, the politicos from the state legislature would come for pastrami sandwiches and matzo ball soup. So again, yeah, it was easier. But this is actually a national trend with the decline of delis, and there is a kind of nouveau deli movement arising. I think there's a new one I know there's one in Cary now, and Ish, I guess, in Raleigh. So and Charlotte also had a kosher deli. So that's, but if you think about it, it's much easier to find a bagel in North Carolina now than it is a Southern biscuit. Mm. And I remember Tim McLaurin, a Southern writer, complaining that when he asked to find a Southern biscuit, he was referred to the ethnic foods section. So,
okay. Okay, maybe one more question. So switching gears a little bit here. You mentioned male Jewish attendance at UNC Chapel Hill and Jewish female students at Greensboro. Were there quotas for Jewish students at these universities? I recall hearing that Manning had instituted strict quotas for Jewish students at the UNC Medical School.
UNC was under Frank Graham. I discovered one year, I think it was 1936, less than 1% of the population of North Carolina was Jewish. Something like 15% of the entering class at Chapel Hill was Jewish. Isaac Manning, the dean of the medical school, did maintain a quota of 4 Jewish students, 10%, and that was only a 2-year medical school, and he claimed he couldn't place Jewish students in 4-year medical students. When a Jewish student complained to Frank Graham, he called in the dean and told him to admit the students and to put an end to the quota. And the two of them got into a public argument that broke into the national press, and Graham forced the resignation of Dean Manning and the admission of the student. I did see statistics at Duke in the 1930s, and the Jewish enrollment there never rose much above 3% for the undergraduate school, and it was 15% at the medical school. Jews had been instrumental in founding the medical school at Duke. So a quota did operate there. And then there have always been issues at places like Davidson, for example, and Wake Forest. I don't have any statistics on them. I doubt that Women's College had a Jewish quota. I don't know that Jews would be significant enough to need a quota, but there were Jews who were very prominent also at that university. buildings named after Rosenthal, Wheel, and so on.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. We did have a couple questions. Folks asked where they will be able to access this recording. So this presentation has been recorded and it will go out, it will be uploaded to YouTube and then will go out to all participants in an email shortly. So look for that soon and feel free to share the recording far and wide. I just want to give a quick shameless plug. If you have not yet seen the Down Home exhibit in the Capitol and you are able to get to Raleigh, please feel free to come visit. The exhibit is up until the end of May. The Capitol is open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and Saturdays, 10 to 5. You're always welcome. Even if you can't make it down to see the exhibit before the end of May, please come visit the Capitol. You're always welcome in the North Carolina State Capitol. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone. Thank you so much, Leonard, for all of your knowledge and for sharing all of this information with us. Thank you to Judge Mark Davis, to Jewish Heritage NC, and especially to Rachel Werner, to my colleagues, Jennifer Farley, and to my colleague at the Capitol, Bobby, for helping to moderate this evening. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us this evening, and we hope that you enjoyed.